Time for us to begin our afternoon worship service. We're glad for everyone that's back for this service. If you're visiting with us, we're especially glad you're here and invite you back anytime. Come be with us. Remember those sick and shut in that are in the bulletin and the announcements that are in there. Keep those in your mind. Remember those things. There's several announcements in there this week. Also remember that these individuals are at home sick. Laura Talley, Ruth Roden, Jeremy Jean, and Billy Long. Remember those individuals. And, of course, Maxine Chapman was taken to the ER. Let's remember those individuals. On our sheet, where we have the visitation sheet, Billy Cole's been moved. He's now in Columbia at Morning Point in Columbia. That's if you turn right there at Graymere, it's up there on the left, so keep that in mind. Are there other things we need to announce? Of course, our speaker again this afternoon is Eric Cheney, and we're looking forward to that. Are there other things that we need to announce? Then let's join in with the singing.
375. 375. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand, by faith on heaven's able way. A higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay. Though some may dwell where these abound, my prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand, by faith on heaven's able land. A higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost high and catch a gleam of glory bright. But still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand, by faith on heaven's stable land. A higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. For our opening prayer, we'll sing 384. 384. I have found a friend in Jesus, he's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my stay. He tells me every care on him to roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning please give them an extra measure of strength and knowledge to lead this congregation in the best possible way, please. And Father, we thankful for you and your Son Jesus and your willingness to send him here to die on the cross for the remission of our sins. And we ask you to please forgive us of our sins and help us to be good, strong Christians. And Father, please be with Brother James. He's about to bring us a lesson. Please bless him, give him the extra measure of strength as he gets up before us to speak another lesson. Please help him have a ready recollection of the things that he prepared, that he presented in the best possible way that he can. Heavenly Father, please be with us as we go through the remainder of this season. In Christ's name we pray.
Lord, go ahead and mark the invitation song will be 920. 920. Now we'll sing 799. 799. Walking alone at eve and viewing the skies afar, bidding the darkness come to welcome me, silver star. I have a great delight in the wonderful scenes above. God inspired and might is showing his truth and love. Oh, we're home with God, oh, blessed discourse to rest, sure in a safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love, where I'll be pure and bold and live with my God above. Closing my eyes and leave and thinking of heaven's grace, longing to see my Lord, yes, meeting him face to face, trusting him as my all, wheresoever my footsteps roam, leading with him to guide me onto the Spirit's home. Oh, we're home with God, a blessed discourse to rest, sure a safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love, where I'll be pure and whole and live with my God above.
Good afternoon, church. Thank you again for allowing me to speak one more time to you on this Lord's Day. I can't speak much for the preaching, but the food was excellent. So thank you for letting us eat with you and get to know some of you better. We certainly enjoyed that this evening. On October 29th, 1929, was a day known in this country as Black Tuesday. The American stock market, it had been roaring steadily upward for almost a decade, and suddenly it crashed. Banks failed, the nation's money supply diminished, things went bad. The federal government's job had failed its people. This day was known as the beginning of an era known as the Great Depression. You may remember reading about it in your history books. You may remember or had a relative that lived through this and shared the experiences and stories with you about this terrible time in our country. And in such a terrible time, 1932 comes around, an election year, President Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1933. And so President Roosevelt knows what's going on. He sees there's a problem. And so he comes up with this solution known as the New Deal. If you've ever been down to my neck of the woods, me and my wife, and you go towards Muscle Shoals, you go towards Colbert County, you'll cross what's known as the TVA Dam. You'll cross Wheeler Dam, or you'll cross Wilson Dam, or you may have been out west to the Hoover Dam. All of those establishments were from this New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority. You may know of that. You may have worked there or been affiliated. That came from this New Deal. This country was in a depression. Our banks were in a mess. People didn't have money to buy things. If you talk to my folks, they lived on a farm. They didn't know they were poor unless what? Unless you told them, right? They just thought they were living their best life, at least in their minds. But the people that weren't on the farms, the people that were in the cities, and the people that were used to spending a lot of money, they all of a sudden did not have it. That all of a sudden was gone. And so when President Roosevelt got elected, he promised to do what? To have a new deal. He promised to fix this country. He promised to have this quote. And this quote, it aimed to stabilize the economy, provide jobs and relief to those who were suffering. Over the next 8 years, the government instituted a series of experimental projects known as the New Deal, and it was, quote, aimed to restore some measure of dignity and prosperity to many Americans, end quote. More than that, Roosevelt's New Deal permanently changed the federal government's relationship to the U.S. populace. Tomorrow morning, or maybe Friday afternoon, when you walk into your bank, what do you see on the doors? What's on the doors of your bank? You'll see 4 letters that says FD what? FDIC, right? You know what those 4 letters stand for? Because of this New Deal, and because of the depression, that your money is now insured. And so you may lose some of it, but this FDIC will protect your money, so you may lose some, but you will not lose all of it. It's got insurance. It's got protection. That protection came from this New Deal as well. So we see how President Roosevelt's goal was to restore the prosperity and restore the bank system and restore Americans to where they could live the American dream, quote. And that was all well and good, right? And we're still receiving the benefits from that. It was a good plan. It was a good deal. It was the New Deal. And it restored America back to where it needed to go. If you have your Bibles this afternoon, I want you to open with me to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, where God looks down on the earth, and what does he see? Genesis chapter 1 tells us that God created what? The world, right? And he created the trees and the animals. And then in Genesis 1 verse 27 it says God made who? Man in his own image, right? God created man in his likeness. So God had made this beautiful world, and God had made man, and he wanted man to live in the garden, and he wanted man to prosper, and he wanted man to enjoy this earth. Is that what we see in Genesis chapter 6? Is man happy? Is man living for the intention as God wanted him to live? We see here where God looked at man, and what was man doing? Every thought was what? Evil continually. Every thought of man was evil continually. This beautiful creation that God had made, something had went completely wrong. Something had went completely bad with it. And what was going on? Why was man's thought evil continually? We could say that at this time the world was in a depression, at least in God's eyes. And so God said what? It sorrowed God. And then He found grace through Noah. And He decided He was going to start over through Noah. And He sent the flood on the earth. Noah and his 8 people in the ark were saved. And through Noah, God instituted a new plan. God instituted a new plan. If you'll turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 through 21. We see where Paul makes mention of this new plan, this new deal that God comes up with Noah and the prophets. And then we'll see where that winds up in just a few moments. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul is reminding the church at Corinth, this is what God's plan was. For the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus that if one died for all, then all died. And He died for all. And those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for Him who died them and rose again. Therefore, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh, even though we have known Christ according to the flesh. Yet now we know Him no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away, and all things have become new. Verse 18. Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to Himself through Jesus Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. And he goes on to explain, that is, God was in Christ, reconciling the world to Himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ. As though God were pleading through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Be reconciled to God. Now let's look at what Paul is trying to tell us. Let's look at what Paul is trying to say here. Notice in verse 14, the love of Christ compels us. What does that word compel mean? Why do you cook dinner for your family on holidays? Why do you show your loved ones you care about them? Why do you do those things? Is it important? Or does that compel you? Do you want to do good things for your loved ones? It compels you because they helped you out, right? And they loved you and they took care of you. So when it was our turn, we wanted to make sure we took advantage of our turn, right? It compels you. Does the love of Christ compel you this evening to live for Him? Does the love of Christ compel you to study His Word? Does the love of Christ compel you to be a faithful member in His congregation? And then he explains what Christ did for us. Notice in verse 20. Notice in verse 20 what he says. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Compel means it motivates us. Compel means it makes us want to do something. Well, what does reconcile mean? What is reconciliation? In order to reconcile, there has to be what? A separation. Isaiah 59 tells us that sin separates us from who? From God. Sin separates us from God. In Genesis 6, when the world was evil, the world was separated from God. And if we remain lost, we remain in sin, that separates us from God. That keeps us from being where God is at. But notice the compulsion here. Notice the encouragement here. Notice what Paul is saying. You've been separated from God, so now you can come back to Him. Now there's a new deal for you. Now you can be a new Christian. Now you can be a new child of God in Christ. We implore you. We command you. We ask you. We encourage you. We want you to be reconciled to God. We want you to come back to God. Why? Why do I need to come back to Jesus? Why do I need to put Him on? Why is it important that I even obey? Notice verse 21. For He made Him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in Him. Think of it in this sense. Think of it as you committed a crime. And not only did you commit a crime, you got caught doing the crime. And you got brought in to your trial. And you were standing before that jury, and you were standing before that judge. And just as that judge was going to give you that sentence, somebody came busting in from the back and said, I'll take your place. I'll take your place. When we committed the offense, we were guilty and we deserved whatever the judge sentenced. We deserved it. But that person took the sentence from us. You see, that's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what Jesus did for us. He came running in and said, don't punish them, Lord. I'll take their place. I'll go to the cross. I'll stand there in their behalf. Be reconciled. Jesus did that for us. And that compels us to obey Him. That compels us to do what He's commanded us to do. 2 Corinthians 5 just gives us an illustration that how we can become a new Christian and what Jesus did for us. He also gave us the New Testament. He also gave us how to become a child of God. He also gave us words to live by and words to guide our lives by. Matthew 26 and verse 28. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many, the remission of sins. The new covenant. So what is the new covenant? Well, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 16 through 17, we see where this testament is fulfilled. Remember, Matthew told us it was a new covenant, a new testament. Verse 16 of Hebrews 9. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. So, what do we get from all this? Have you ever known someone that received an inheritance? Unless you're the prodigal son and you get anxious and you want it early, usually you don't receive that inheritance until the one giving it has allowed you to have it. And in Hebrews it says the testator has to go on first. The testator has to pass away. And so up until the cross, up until Jesus said, it is finished, and up until His spirit went to heaven and His body remained on the cross, then Jesus was still on this earth. But after that point, after Jesus said it was accomplished, after Jesus said He finished it, then it became active. Now we know he didn't stay in the tomb. We know 3 days later he came out of there and ascended up to heaven. In Acts chapter 1 tells us that he went to be at the right hand of God. Acts chapter 7, where Stephen looks up and sees Jesus on his throne, living and active and ruling from heaven. All those things were true, but it couldn't happen until Jesus went to the cross. It couldn't happen until this testament was fulfilled. And so, not only did he give us Jesus, but he gave us his word. He gave us his New Testament, his new covenant. And so what do we do being a new Christian with a New Testament? We have a new commandment. John chapter 13 and verse 34. John chapter 13 and verse 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, so that you also love one another. By this we will know that you are my disciples, if you have loved one for another. We have a saying in our country, when the rubber meets the road, less talk and more action, right? Don't show me. Don't just tell me. What? Show me, right? I don't want you to just talk about it. I don't want you to just act like it. I want you to show it. I want you to live it. I could tell my wife I love her all the time, but I show it when I take her out to Legends on Friday, right? I show her by doing nice things for her, and she shows me when she's got me a wonderful supper cooked and things like that. She doesn't just say it, and we don't just tell each other, we show each other. And we work that way in the church. We don't just stand up here and preach about God and Jesus. We live it out, and we act it out, and we show our love for one another when a brother or sister is hurting and needs comforting. When a brother or sister needs prayers of encouragement. When a brother or sister just needs a simple thank you card, a simple phone call. That's how we show our love for one another. And Jesus says when we do that, what? We know we are His people. We know we are His people by living it out. By this, all will know you are my disciples. Don't just tell me you're a member of Summertown. Show me you're a member of Summertown by how you live your life and by how you act. Don't just tell me you know God. Show me by being faithful to Him, by living your life for Him. The brethren in Ephesus were dealing with some of these issues, so Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 24, "This I say and testify, you should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart." So what separates me from God? Sin does. Being alienated, being separate, being apart, being blinded. And what does that? The blindness of their heart. Verse 19, "Who in the past gave themselves over to iniquity and uncleanliness and greediness." But what? Not us. Not the people of God. Not the church. Not the Lord's people. You have not learned so. We don't act that way. We don't do what the world does. And we don't accept what the world accepts. We do what Christ does. And we accept what God accepts. And that's how we live our life. Notice what he says here. Verse 21. "Indeed, you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus. You put off your former conduct. The old man is corrupt and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, that ye put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. You see, Jesus gave us himself. Jesus gave us the New Testament, and then Jesus gave us a command to enforce the Testament, and that's to love one another. And I say all that to say this. Why is it important? Because you too can have this new life. You too can be part of God's kingdom. You too can stop living for sin and the world and everything else that's distracting you from living for God, and you can become a new creation, a new Christian right now as we stand and sing.